Well, first off, thank you so much for taking the time to talk today. It's a real pleasure.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for asking.
So, I guess just to get to know you, at what point in your life did you decide that music was the direction you wanted to go in, and I guess more specifically, composing for narratives?
Well, that's an interesting question because I think probably around about age 5, I started, apart from bashing the piano in my parents' house sort of a lot and actually storytelling with the piano at that young age. I mean, for me, music, I think, started off as a form of storytelling. But I was also playing with a puppet theatre, and I would put on pieces of music and do kind of pieces of sort of very crude puppetry. And I was just really excited about what music could do for storytelling. And in fact, I think I felt at that age that music was a story. That was sort of the point of it for me. I mean, I love melody, I love music in concert settings and so on, but I find it very difficult to separate music from drama mentally. So I've never been somebody, for example, who's had a parallel career, much as I admire people who do. I mean, John Williams being a great exponent of somebody who's got an extraordinary concert music catalogue, for want of a better word, repertoire. I love pieces of his like Tree Song, but again, I listen to that piece, for example, and I hear a story. There is one implied there, but so I think that the two things of narrative and music have pretty much been inseparable for me as long as I can remember.
And did you have any musicians or composers playing a big role in influencing you and inspiring you?
Well, that's tricky. I've got very, very Catholic taste.
Okay.
I love a huge range of music, from the more dissonant end of the spectrum right through to the most sort of passionate, romantic, melodic writing. And I love film composers who try to rethink the way that music can work with narrative. Sometimes that's not successful, but I love to see people experimenting with the idiom and finding new ways of telling stories. Just in the proms, the proms in London the other night was the most extraordinary performance of Alexander Nevsky, and it was really interesting to hear it because Prokofiev took some really interesting risks with that, but they all pay off. I mean, but perhaps possibly not surprising for such a great composer, but but it is the most. It's wonderful to hear such emotional intensity coming from an orchestra like that. It's a fantastic piece of work. So I would,
sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I would count him as an inspiration, but amongst many other composers.
Right. Well, I'd like to congratulate you on your Emmy nomination for Any Human Heart. That must have been a big thing for you.
It's lovely, and if I can be immodest, it follows surreally swiftly on the toes of receiving an Ivor Novello Award and a BAFTA Award here in Britain. So I have to say I think I've been very lucky in getting the project, because I think it was a gift for a composer to work on. It's such a passionate story, and it's a story which encompasses a whole man's life. So, I mean, it's quite an intimidating challenge to take that on, but we all want challenges, we all want to be pushed, and I think that lies, I have that to thank for the success that the series has received.
And how did you get involved with the project?
Well, actually, very often one is approached by a member of the production team who you've worked with before, such as the editor. Most typically, I'd say, editors tend to be your allies in forging new relationships with directors and so on. But in this case, I was approached by a completely fresh team of people, none of whom I'd worked with before. And they were obviously scouting for people, and I had never asked them quite why they approached me, but they obviously liked some of the things I said in an interview, and obviously they were listening closely to demo reels and so on.
Right.
And I remember at the time I have a parallel career doing sort of rather strange large-scale artworks outdoors, one of which I should say is just in the last couple of weeks played over London. It's played from 7 hot air balloons in a sort of giant surround sound system.
Wow.
And it marked the beginning of the countdown to the London Olympics in 2012. But at that time, which is pretty much a year ago now, I was working on another piece very similar in a way that is played from 7 ice cream vans, which parade around a neighborhood and create, again, a sort of giant interlocking counterpoint of music that I've composed that people hear haunting the sort of skies and the air over a suburb and coming from the distance. And actually, funny enough, that came to me as an idea when I was working on a film. And it was a film set in Margate, which is a British seaside town, which, to be frank, has probably seen better days, though I'm hasten to add it's on the up now, not wishing to offend any citizens of Margate. But I thought, what is the sound of the seaside town? It's the sound of ice cream vans approaching in the distance. And I thought, it was a rather sad story, and I thought, what if, rather than the jaunty music you hear typically, what if you heard something slightly sad and melancholy unfolding, and then, almost like a conspiracy, another van comes and joins in from a different direction. And that's where the idea came from. And I was working on this at the time I met the producers and director, Michael Samuels, for Any Human Heart. And I think they were so intrigued that I was going off and doing such strange things that they sort of thought that alongside my, a fairly solid body of work for film and television, that I was worth taking a bet on. So they did, and I'm very pleased.
Well, it's a very well-deserved nomination. But you have a large filmography that balances, TV and films. And do you find any major differences between the two mediums when it comes to, composing for, I guess, a shorter form narrative within, 2 hours, or a longer form narrative that stretches, several episodes?
That's a very good question. I think the form is the great challenge in film music and television, and sort of, delivering your score to fit the length. I think you sort of answered the question with your question, in the sense that is, for me, I think that trying to hone the form dramatically through the music is what excites me most. I mean, it would be arrogant to say that being able to write music is like an actor being able to talk, but you do have to sort of be as good at curating your work through the form of the piece as you do at writing. And I think, in a way, they're two separate tasks. I'm failing to answer your question by saying this in a way, sort of buying myself some time. But one thing I try to do now is I actually have 2 separate rooms to work in. One for writing, rolling up my sleeves, getting the spanners out and putting the hood up, and really getting down to musical nuts and bolts and programming and orchestrating and so on. And then the other room is very much about how the music is working with the film or the television episode in situ. So to sit down, curl up on a sofa almost, and watch it like I had nothing to do with it, and see how it's affecting me as close as I can become. I mean, obviously it's like trying to, tickle yourself, but it's impossible. But you try to get some distance from it and see how the music is working in the context of the film. And for me, I was actually inspired to do that by Pixar, because I know it's not completely analogous, but I thought their working process, the idea that they review their work every day, is just fantastic. I think it's so simple in one sense. I mean, it sounds obvious. You think, well, everybody should do that. But the problem with writing music is you really get into a kind of fairly furious work cycle, especially with the timetables we have. And you need to make a deliberate attempt, I think, to get out of that cycle, to review what you do. So that doesn't answer your question. I suppose thinking about that, form is the key difference. I mean, the length of the form is obviously key to getting that right. But the other thing I love about cinema is there are usually longer time scales.
Right, yeah.
And so that curating process, I think, becomes a bit richer. So you have more time to actually reconsider what you've written and think about taking some risks or not. Well, they become less of a risk because you have a chance to see how they work in the entire context. So I've worked on projects, for example, Max, which was a John Cusack project directed by Mendes, where I'd written certain pieces for certain scenes, and I sat down with Mendes, and he said, he's quite he's a very brave guy, and in storytelling and an expert storyteller. And he said, you know, we should try that cue over there, and that piece you wrote for that scene, we should try it over there. And at first I was quite upset, you know, and I sort of thought, well, this is crazy, because I spent ages refining that music for that particular scene. And you know what, he was right. And I learned a huge amount from him about just thinking the music through again and seeing, it's about taking stock, seeing what you've got and how to apply it. Of course, there are certain things you can't do that with. They're written just too closely to music. But when you're dealing with a film such as that, which is it's a very delicate subject. It was about Hitler, actually, and the emotional intensity required was obviously, well, it had to be very delicately balanced, because we could have gone too far and brought the thing out in a rash. But we were, you know, it was looking at the emotional pitch of the music and seeing where it fitted best. And I think it's you know, it's in Britain at the moment, television is increasingly under pressure, sort of year on year. The schedules seem to get shorter, and so it's you know, I don't want to be negative about it, but I think that the greatest thing about film is having just that bit extra time to consider how the music beds into the film.
I mean, also working on television, I mean, you talk about timetable and all that, and deadlines, but is it easy to lose focus? I mean, you're composing, I guess, more quantity, higher quantity of music. Is it easier for your, I guess, the focus of the music just to kind of drift off, and you may be like, oh, I forgot what we were doing at the beginning of the series, and kind of, you know, how do you keep your music like focused throughout the entire
That's a really
narrative?
interesting question. Funnily enough, I don't find I have that problem. I'm surprised I don't, because logically you would think that were the case. But in fact, I think all composers are probably familiar with that process of getting into the zone. And you know, with a certain amount of experience, you may not be so worried about the sort of blank page syndrome once you're a fair way into your career. You certainly accumulate speed, and as it were, you've gained a familiarity with the geography of the drama. So you've got to know your characters, you've got to know and understand their relationships. And it's great as well working on a series such as a 4-parter like Any Human Heart, where we had effectively 4 feature-length episodes. And I think by the 4th episode, I was in the zone, as they say. You know, I hope so. Anyway, it's not for me to say that, but I really felt I understood and identified with Logan Mount Stewart, the central character. At least as an audience member, I identified with him, and I you know, so you're working sort of on ever more subtle nuances, and I think that's a great pleasure and privilege, where you've got, you know, 3 times 1.5 hours behind you, and you can actually start to refine those ideas and bring them to bear. I think, you know, had I done those 4 episodes separately, you know, it's sort of like if it was a 4-part series of sequels in a film that were spaced apart by a year, you wouldn't have that continuity. And so I think actually the continuous sort of nature of doing a series means that you can really home in on the emotional intensity and detail that you really want to.
Right, and which, yeah, I mean, I agree completely with that. I've talked to, you know, a few other composers who, I think I mentioned it to someone, and he goes, you know, I really didn't even think about that. He was like always composing in the moment, so I thought it was always interesting to see what everyone's take on that is. But you also have a background in you know, live theater as well, right?
That's right, yes.
So that must be a completely different animal, composing for, you know, a performance that's live on stage, but it's still, you're, you know, telling a story. And I'm sure, I guess timing would be my biggest question. Like, how does timing work, you know, when you're composing something that's performed in the moment?
That's very true. I mean, the technology has got a lot more advanced to help make that more achievable, because obviously nothing's locked off as it would be with a final cut on a film. So you're absolutely right. You need to create the music in a way which is flexible. But I think you come at it from the start with that in mind. And so you do possibly do less underscoring, for example, or if you do underscoring, you bring your musical components if I can put it that mechanically, in a way in which they can be layered up with separate trigger points. And there's fantastic software now for making that realizable. I mean, I do work with a lot of electronic ambient music in theatre because it is more applicable in a way.
Right.
I'm very lucky to be working now at the National Theatre, and we're still trying to work out how much live music, direct live performance we can input into the piece, because of course naturally working with live performers gives you the greatest flexibility because they can actually just listen to what's going on and respond, but you obviously have to write in a way which gives them the chance to do that. It's surprising how, despite the fact that things change from night to night, there's still an amazing consistency in the way that actors deliver things, and as long as you build in a certain kind of elasticity in the music, and you're working with a lovely bunch of players who can tune into that, as I did just a couple of months ago at the Royal Shakespeare Company, then it actually becomes a magical thing, because it's like having the film orchestra live every night for the film. They can respond to the actors. They get to know things that they actually, you're kind of delegating things in a way which is delightful, because they will take that on and they will understand what you've offered up in sort of manuscript terms, musical manuscript, and they will then, actually take it on twice as far again in terms of their expression, which they kind of improve, and it mellows like fine wine every night. It's magical, actually. It's a lovely thing.
So, and also, I guess you've also composed documentaries, which I think is another different animal to tackle. I mean, it's a narrative, a film of a narrative, but does it affect your writing process knowing that the story and the characters are all real?
I think that's a really interesting question, and you've again hit on one of the central points there in your question, which is about what a difference it makes for a character to be fictional. And it could sound pretentious, but I do go strongly with the idea that you need to take your characters really seriously in drama, as if they were real. And if you want your audience to sort of fall in love with them in some way, you have to do that. It's a difficult thing, because, for example, I've worked on a documentary about the Rwandan genocide, which is pretty much the darkest kind of subject one could expect ever to work on in a documentary. And I was taking my foot right off the gas there in terms of trying to peddle any kind of emotion, because you actually, as much as respecting the tragedy of the people involved, you want to respect the audience's intelligence about how they're coming at it and what they understand. And in that sort of situation, I feel that the music is trying to, this is purely a metaphor, obviously, but it's trying to create a space for the audience and the subject matter to share, so that the audience feel connected and closer to the subject, rather than trying to push their emotions in any way at all. And I actually learned a lot. I like to think I learned a lot from that sort of way of thinking when it comes to drama, and I think it does apply to some of the people I admire working in feature films in Hollywood and elsewhere, and some very great filmmakers as well have sort of embraced that idea that you must, that half the work music can do is bringing the audience closer to the characters, and to respect them in a way, if you want sort of genuine empathy and compassion in your audience, that you do treat them in the same way as if they were real. I think there are more similarities than differences in a way. See, that might not apply to some fantastic thing like Toy Story, but I and of course there's fantastic fantasies and action movies where that may not apply in the same way at all, but certainly for the more sort of honed and delicate dramas, psychological dramas, I think there's a lot of that which does apply.
Right. Yeah, I agree completely. I guess, or what's the hardest part about telling a story through music, in your opinion?
Well, I think it's. I like to think that it's. I think we've already dealt with it in a way. I think form, and sustaining the form, and making sure that you have enough perspective on the whole trajectory of the story. To do it justice, because it's very easy to get very excited about what your music is doing for a particular scene, but then as we all know, there's the trick when you watch it on a run of realizing that you just either went too far or didn't go far enough. And it's seeing how it works on a run that I think is the difficult thing. And excuse me, we all work in processes which mean, right up through the final mix of the dub of the film, where you're bringing everything together, the dialogue and the sound effects and so on. I think we can tend to work in very small cycles and lose our perspective. So I think that's one great challenge. But the other thing is just finding the music which doesn't do what I call a placard for the emotion. It has to, we can all write things which are identifiable as signifying happy or sad or jealous or in love. But I think the ambition for every composer I know and have, enjoyed sort of talking to is obviously to go beyond that and try and see those sort of magic things in the air that really make the audience feel that, rather than telling the audience that's what's going on. And and that's it's not that that's necessarily difficult. Well, it is difficult, but I mean it's the ambition. It's what I aspire to personally, and it's why perhaps I've been a bit iconoclastic at the way I've come at some of the scores I've done is because I may have sort of taken things in a roundabout route to get there, but it's because I'm sort of trying to try out as many different ideas as possible. I have what I call a high shooting ratio. I really try and write a lot for each film and throw away a lot as well.
Mm. So if that's the hardest, what's the easiest?
Oh, it all feels so easy when you've written it all and you just go, dust yourself down and you think, yeah, that wasn't so bad, was it? But the torture involved sometimes, when you're up at 3 in the morning, that's the hard thing. 3:30 in the morning, and you've still not got that big idea that symbolizes the sort of central thesis of the film. What's the easiest thing? I think towards the end of a. I tell you what's easy is handing your score over to brilliant players. I adore that. I absolutely love it. I worked with a great conductor on Any Human Heart, Alistair King, who looked at my score, made some very intelligent questions, very simple questions about what I wanted, and then, delightfully, I have to say, said very few things to the orchestra and just generated such emotional intensity from what they were doing. From one piece I'd written that was pretty much a kind of 3:30 in the morning type of piece, but a very important one because it was to be played right at the end of the first episode and was basically, without wanting to give anything away for anybody who's not seen it and wants to enjoy it, there's an amazing sort of emotional dilemma right at the end of the first episode for the central character, Logan. And that was a delight, working with Alistair King. Can I just say one other thing, though, is delightful, is to work with a story written by a man like William Boyd, who wrote the novel and adapted it, because it is just masterful storytelling. It's an extraordinary novel, and I think if I'd read the novel, I'd have said you probably shouldn't adapt it for television, because it relies on such labyrinthine detail in the history of a whole man's life. But actually, he did an amazing job with Michael Samuels of selecting exactly what was required to take you through this whole life story, which is also a story of the 20th century. So that was a delight as well. And of course, as a composer, whilst you might complain about the fact you're last in line for the budget and schedule, you also inherit the contributions of virtually everybody else. And in this case, it was a stellar cast, and so sort of riding on all their talent, I have to say, is a fantastic feeling, and it makes me feel quite guilty as well about winning any awards, because I sort of think they should get a bit more of the credit. But that sounds ridiculous, but you sort of feel, you see where I'm coming from.
Right, yeah.
You're inheriting a lot of hard work from other people, which is a great inspiration.
But I've always thought that one of the score's main responsibilities is to pretty much tie everything, all of those aspects of film together: cinematography, production design, story. So it kind of blends them all together and creates a mosaic and a quilt, if you will, of and just binds everything together. So that's what so I guess, I mean, if you're doing that, then I think you're doing the right thing. So
Well, that's yes, it's a lovely way of putting it. It's sort of tying a bow on the whole thing. And again, the challenges and the successes and the ease or difficulty with which that happens may be to do with the ease or difficulty with which those things are going together anyway. In some ways, sometimes it feels like you're trying to find a magic bullet that will just, sort of silver bullet that will absolutely solve a very particular kind of issue to do with possibly tonal discrepancies and so on. I mean, that's happened in everybody's career. I have to say, not the case in Any Human Heart. Everything was working together beautifully. And I was also handed some incredibly intelligent and brilliant steers about the spotting of the music by the editor and the director, Michael Samuels, who, I really felt very lucky about that. So but you're absolutely right. It is trying to bring all of those things together.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess to close things, wrap things up, I always like to ask composers if you had the opportunity to rescore any film ever made without any disrespect to the original composer, which film would you pick?
Oh, that is so difficult. I found, and of course, the cruel thing about that question is it feels like it would be intensely disrespectful to any composer. I mean, I think there are probably. I think it would be great to do a score for Metropolis, perhaps, or I mean, oh gosh, I want to go away for about 2 days and think about that. I think there are just films I adore, and normally, if I adore them, I think that's because of the music. It's the tricky thing about that question as well is not to mistake simply the films you love. Sometimes you might love them not because of the music in particular anyway. I mean, I'm not, sort of complete sort of, I don't watch films just because of the music anyway, but that's a tricky one. Can I come back to you about it?
Yeah, sure, no problem. You can email it to me if you'd like.
Yes, I will. There's a postscript. We'll tie that one on.
All right, well, Dan, thank you so much for your time, and I know you're wrapping up your day in England right now, so have a good night.
And you, and we'll have a good rest of your day, and thanks for talking to me. It's really delightful to talk to you, Kai. Thanks.